All right, everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic a lot of you have been asking about: vitamin D.
Yeah, it's one of those things we hear about all the time, but most folks don't really know the ins and outs.
Right. Like, we know it's good for strong bones, but it's way more than just a bone builder.
Oh, absolutely. It's practically a superhero working behind the scenes to keep your muscles, nerves, and even your immune system in tip-top shape.
So it's kind of like a multitasker, huh? Like it's got its hands in all these different systems, making sure things are running smoothly.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Every cell in your body has a receptor for vitamin D, so it's clearly important for, well, pretty much everything.
Okay, so we know it's important, but how do we actually know if we're getting enough of this superhero vitamin?
Well, that's where the 25-hydroxy vitamin D test comes in.
25 what now?
It's a mouthful, I know, but basically, it's a blood test that tells your doctor how much usable vitamin D is actually in your system.
Usable vitamin D. Is there like unusable vitamin D?
Sort of. The vitamin D we get from the sun or supplements has to be converted by our body before it can actually be used.
Ah, so it's like a transformation process.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The vitamin D we get from sunlight or pills is like a raw ingredient, and our liver is the master chef, transforming it into this superpowered form called, yeah, you guessed it, 25-hydroxy vitamin D.
So that's what the test is measuring, the stuff our body can actually use.
Yep, it's a gold standard for assessing your vitamin D status.
Okay, that makes sense. So who should actually be getting this test?
Well, doctors often recommend it if someone has symptoms that might point to a deficiency.
Like what kinds of symptoms?
Things like muscle weakness or bone pain.
Yikes, that doesn't sound fun.
Yeah, but sometimes those symptoms can be subtle, so it's important to be aware of them. And even if you don't have any obvious symptoms, there are certain groups who might be at a higher risk of deficiency.
Like who?
Well, folks over 65, for example. As we age, our skin doesn't convert sunlight to vitamin D as efficiently.
Oh, that makes sense.
And people with darker skin tones, too. Melanin, which gives skin its color, actually acts as a natural sunscreen, so it can sometimes block some of those UVB rays needed to make vitamin D.
So basically anyone who might not be getting enough sunshine.
Exactly. And those living in, let's say, less sunny climates, or even during those winter months when the days are shorter.
Right, less sunshine equals less vitamin D.
Makes sense. Are there any other reasons someone might not be absorbing enough vitamin D?
Definitely. Certain medical conditions can interfere with absorption, like celiac or Crohn's disease.
Oh, I see.
And being overweight or obese can also impact how much vitamin D your body can use.
Really? How so?
It seems like vitamin D can get trapped in fat cells, making it less available for other important tasks.
Huh, I never knew that.
And get this, even babies, especially breastfed babies, might need a little extra vitamin D.
What? I thought breast milk was like the perfect food. It is incredible, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't naturally contain high levels of vitamin D. So doctors often recommend a supplement or a test, especially for those little ones.
Wow, you learn something new every day.
Okay.
So we've talked about who might need this test, but what about understanding the results? How do we know what those numbers actually mean?
Well, vitamin D levels are measured in nanograms per milliliter. It's like a ruler for your vitamin D. Anything below 12 is considered deficient, while levels between 12 and 20 are, well, kind of a gray area. It might not be a full-blown deficiency, but it could still be impacting your health.
Interesting. So even if you're not technically deficient, those lower levels could still be a problem.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have the optimal range, typically between 20 and 50 nanograms per milliliter.
Got it. So under 12 is deficient, 12 to 20 is iffy, and 20 to 50 is the sweet spot.
Precisely.
Okay, that all makes sense. Now, I've heard a lot about vitamin D2 and D3. What's the difference between those two?
Those are just two different forms of vitamin D. We get D2 mostly from plants and fortified foods, while D3 is the kind we make from sunlight and get from some animal products.
Oh, so kind of like two sides of the same coin.
Exactly. But when it comes to the test, your doctor will mainly look at your total vitamin D levels.
Okay, makes sense. So is there anything else we need to know about the test itself?
Well, it's important to remember that those exact ranges might vary a bit depending on the lab that processed your test, so always talk to your doctor about what your results mean specifically for you.
Right, it's always best to get that personalized advice. So before we move on, have any of those risk factors or symptoms we talked about resonated with you? If so, maybe jot down a little reminder to chat with your doctor about vitamin D. It's always better to be safe than sorry, right? Now let's dive into what happens when our vitamin D levels are out of whack.
Sounds good to me. Let's start with low vitamin D.
All right, so when we're talking about low vitamin D, what kind of risks are we actually talking about?
Well, obviously, there's the risk of weak bones, which can lead to fractures and
Yeah,
osteoporosis.
that's what most people associate with vitamin D deficiency.
Right. But it actually goes way beyond that. Research has linked low vitamin D to a whole bunch of serious conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and even some types of cancer.
Wow, that's a lot more serious than I thought.
Yeah, it really highlights how important vitamin D is for our overall health.
I'd also read somewhere that low vitamin D might even be linked to depression.
That's right. There's growing evidence suggesting a connection between vitamin D deficiency and mood disorders like depression.
Wow, so this sunshine vitamin really is playing a much bigger role in our health than we might realize.
Absolutely. It's involved in so many different processes in the body, and when levels are low, it can have a ripple effect on our overall well-being.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. But it's also important to remember, right, that just because there's a link between low vitamin D and these conditions doesn't necessarily mean it directly causes them.
Exactly. It's more like a piece of the puzzle.
Hmm.
There are likely many factors involved, and your doctor can help you figure out what it all means for you.
Right. It's all about getting that personalized advice and understanding the bigger picture.
Mhm.
So let's flip the script for a second. What happens if our vitamin D levels are too high? Is that even possible?
Believe it or not, it is possible, but it's much less common than a deficiency. It usually happens when people take way too many supplements, thinking that more is always better.
Ah, that makes sense. So with vitamin D, is there such a thing as too much of a good thing?
Definitely. And the symptoms of having too much vitamin D can be quite surprising.
Like what?
Well, think nausea, muscle weakness, and even kidney stones.
Kidney stones. Seriously. From too much vitamin D.
It might sound strange, but it's true. When you have way too much vitamin D, it can mess with how your body handles calcium. You can end up with too much calcium in your blood, and that can lead to all sorts of problems, including those pesky kidney stones you mentioned.
Okay, so it's definitely a balancing act. You don't want too little vitamin D, but too much can backfire in some pretty unpleasant ways. I guess that's why it's so important to work with your doctor.
Exactly. Don't just go popping pills without their guidance. They can help you figure out the right amount of vitamin D for you based on your individual needs and risk factors.
All right, so we've talked a lot about this vitamin D test and why it matters. But I know some people get a little squeamish about needles and blood tests. What can you tell us about the test itself? Is it painful? Complicated?
Not at all. The good news is it's a super simple and pretty much painless procedure. They just take a tiny bit of blood from your arm, kind of like when you donate blood, but on a much smaller scale. You might feel a little pinch, but that's about it.
So none to stress about then.
Nope. And honestly, the benefits of knowing your vitamin D levels and getting that peace of mind are well worth it.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And remember, if you're feeling even a little bit concerned about your vitamin D levels, the best thing you could do is have an open and honest conversation with your doctor. They could help you figure out if testing is right for you and guide you on the best ways to reach those optimal vitamin D levels. So that was a lot of info about the vitamin D test. Ready to move on.
Absolutely. Let's talk about what we can do to make sure we're getting enough of this vital nutrient.
Sounds good to me. Let's talk about how to get our vitamin D levels where they need to be. Okay, so how do we actually make sure we're getting enough of this sunshine vitamin?
Well, there are a couple of key ways to boost your vitamin D levels.
Lay it on me. I'm ready to soak up all the vitamin D knowledge I can.
All right, first up, we've got the good old sunshine. Spending some time outdoors, letting those UVB rays hit your skin, it's one of the most natural ways to boost your vitamin D production.
Soaking up those rays just like Mother Nature intended, right? But how much sun do we actually need? I mean, I know too much sun can be bad for your skin.
Right, you definitely don't want to overdo it. But even just 10 to 15 minutes of midday sun exposure a few times a week can make a big difference.
Okay, that seems manageable. But what about those of us who live in, less sunny places or during the winter months when it's like always cloudy?
I hear you. And that's where a second strategy comes in, getting vitamin D from our diet.
So food, what kind of foods are we talking about here?
Well, fatty fish like salmon, tuna, and mackerel are excellent sources of vitamin D.
Okay, so seafood lovers rejoice.
Mhm.
What if fish isn't really your thing? Are there any other options?
For sure. Egg yolks are another good source, and some mushrooms, especially those exposed to UV light, can also provide a decent amount of vitamin D. And of course, we can't forget about fortified foods.
Fortified foods, like what?
Think milk, yogurt, orange juice, even some cereals. They're often fortified with vitamin D, which means it's been added in during processing.
So they're like vitamin D superheroes in disguise, huh? Sneaking in those extra nutrients.
Exactly. It's a good way to bump up your intake without having to make major dietary changes.
Okay, so sunshine, food, and fortified foods, those are our three main weapons in the fight against vitamin D deficiency. But what if, despite our best efforts, we're still not getting enough? Is that when supplements come in?
That's right. If you're struggling to get enough vitamin D through those other means, your doctor might recommend a supplement to help you reach those optimal levels.
Okay, so supplements are like our backup plan, just in case.
Exactly. But remember, it's always best to talk to your doctor before starting any new supplements, just to make sure it's the right choice for you and to figure out the correct dosage.
Right, always good to get that personalized advice. So we've covered how to get enough vitamin D, but what about avoiding too much of it? We talked about how excessive supplementation can lead to some pretty unpleasant side effects. Any tips on how to prevent that?
Well, the key is to avoid megadosing.
Megadose.
Yeah, taking those super high doses of vitamin D supplements without a doctor's recommendation. Remember, more is not always better. Stick to the recommended daily intake unless your doctor advises otherwise.
Okay, so follow the dosage instructions and listen to your doctor.
Got it. Are there any other ways to, monitor our intake and make sure we're not going overboard?
Yeah, definitely pay attention to your body. If you start experiencing any of those symptoms we talked about earlier, like nausea, muscle weakness, or frequent urination, those could be signs that your vitamin D levels are too high.
So basically, listen to what your body is telling you. If something feels off, don't ignore it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to reach out to your doctor if you have any concerns. They can run a simple blood test to check your levels and make sure you're right where you need to be.
Right, it's always better to err on the side of caution. So we've talked about what vitamin D is, why it matters, how to get enough of it, and the risks of having too much or too little. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground. Anything else we should touch on before we wrap things up? Well, one thing that's important to keep in mind is that our vitamin D needs can change throughout our lives.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Like how?
Well, for example, infants and older adults often require higher doses than young adults. And pregnant or breastfeeding women also have increased needs.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Our vitamin D needs are dynamic, always evolving.
Exactly. It's all about paying attention to those individual needs and adjusting accordingly.
This has been super informative. I feel like I've learned so much about vitamin D today, and I hope our listeners have too. Any final thoughts you want to leave our audience with?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that vitamin D is much more than just a bone builder. It's a crucial nutrient that plays a role in so many aspects of our health, from our immune system to our mood and even our risk of chronic diseases.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about our bodies and what they need, the better equipped we are to take charge of our health. So armed with all this newfound vitamin D knowledge, what's one small change you can make today to prioritize your vitamin D intake? Maybe it's adding some salmon to your dinner plate tonight, or simply stepping outside for a few minutes to soak up some sunshine.
Or maybe it's finally making that appointment to chat with your doctor about your vitamin D levels. Whatever it is, take that first step. Your body will thank you for it.
Yeah, even just thinking about it more, bringing that awareness to our daily lives, that's a great first step.
Absolutely. And sometimes we forget that health isn't just about these grand gestures. It's about those consistent choices we make day after day.
It's all building healthy habits one step at a time.
Exactly. And just by tuning in today and learning more about vitamin D, you've already taken a step in the right direction.
So true. Now, we've thrown a lot of information at you today about vitamin D, but remember, this deep dive is just the beginning. It's about taking what you've learned and, making it work for you for your own life.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, don't let that flame fizzle out. Keep researching, keep asking questions, keep the conversation going, especially with your doctor.
Couldn't agree more. Because at the end of the day, it's all about taking control of your own health, right?
Yeah.
And who knows, maybe vitamin D will become your new favorite topic to chat about with friends and family.
I wouldn't be surprised. It's definitely more fascinating than most people realize.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about vitamin D, at least for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating health topic.